As we jump into this, just do want to say a big thank you and shout out to Ted and Dar, who were the ones that got the call this morning and came at 4:45 to open the church. So let's just thank them and applaud them. You do need to know that ever since the earthquake, the community has been, and county has been meeting regularly with us and other community organizations and all throughout all ranks, wondering about the next time we're going to face a crisis. And after the fire, that just ramped up more with a thing called COAD, which we're a part of. We are one of the community organizations that is active in disaster. That's what COAD means, and we're obviously sheltering today. And we've been meeting literally monthly for, I don't know, a year or two, talking about how we can be smarter about sheltering. So there's actually a lot that goes in to all this. I want to say up front, because we don't know how many we're going to get, but it is organized, and they know what they're doing for the most part. We'll learn what we don't know this time around, and they're staffed, and they're staffed by people who have taken the oath and certified and all that. Always when something like this happens, people want to help. And the way you can be most helpful is to ask what can be most helpful. And we don't know yet, but one way that's always helpful, on two different levels. One is I'm confident that people are going to start rolling in with lots of bottled water and stuff. That's not really that helpful because we have stores here in Napa that have water, and we can do that, and that's great. But actually, if you really want to be helpful for victims of this stuff, I know it's boring and there's no sex appeal at all on it, but gift cards. Gift cards really, really help because they don't have underwear, and you don't know what size they wear or what color they like, but a Target gift card or a Visa or whatever lets them get very basic stuff going. So that's a very helpful thing. And then there are just a handful of people at CrossWalk that really know the ins and outs of CrossWalk. A lot of our greeting team, because you open things up every Sunday, you're familiar with where stuff is in this space. And having you type people around just to be hosts, not to get in the way, but just to be a presence of CrossWalk for people asking, where do I find the extra toilet paper or whatever, and we know that stuff, that kind of help would be helpful. So just let me or Dar know what's going on, and we can do that together. So anyway, we'll keep you informed. Please like our Facebook page, because that is a way that we can communicate very quickly. And you can see it, and we do a lot of announcing and kind of stuff through that, so please do that. Okay, so we're talking about being changed today, and we're going to take a look at a book in the Bible that actually is well known by many of you, because there are some children's stories that are shared from this particular book in the Bible, and the first half of it anyway is pretty fun. It's a good read, and so it was very popular in Jewish antiquity. It starts off the way the story is that appears to be developing somewhere between 500 and 600 BC and extends, for, I don't know, many decades beyond that. But we're going to find out today that there's more than meets the eye with this particular book. And we're going to spend some time going chapter by chapter just through November, looking at some of these stories that we thought we knew and seeing them with new eyes, because it actually turns out to be incredibly relevant for us living as people of Jesus, trying to follow in the footsteps of Jesus in our relationship with God and understanding of God more than we ever probably realized. And we'll get to some of that stuff in just a second. But first, a trip down memory lane for some of you. Now, some of you who went to school in the information age, like I'm thinking grade school and high school and all that, you missed out on some very special activities back in the day. Back in the day, we had film strips, right? And that meant that two people got two cool jobs in the elementary school. One person got to turn out the lights. That was cool. And turn them back on to make everybody shriek. And the other person got to advance the slides. It was pretty high tech. And everybody looked forward to it. Because because why wouldn't you look forward to a film strip? And then maybe half a dozen times the school I went to anyway, all the students would gather together in the cafeteria, and we'd sit crisscross applesauce, and they'd bring out the projector, one of these big, wheel-to-wheel jobbies, and we'd basically watch the same films every year. And they dealt with the time of the season or whatever. And one of those stories that was regularly told, either through the film strip or maybe through this gathering, was the story of Paul Bunyan. Do you remember Paul Bunyan? Right on. All right, well, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I have a short video for you to remind you of the wonders of this American gem. So, next slide, and we should have a video.
Almighty Paul Bunyan, he lived long ago. His strength and his goodness helped America grow.
When Paul Bunyan was just 1 month old, he placed his baby hands around a young maple tree and tore it out of the ground, roots and all. When he was only 18, he was already 25 feet tall and weighed 800 pounds, all bone and muscle. He took one look at the deep forests of the West and found his job: to chop down the trees to make room for cities, farms, and people.
Come all you sons of freedom that run the forest stream. Come all you roving lumberjacks and listen to my theme. We'll cross the roaring rivers where the mighty waters flow, and we'll roam the wild woods over, and once more a lumbering go, and once more a lumbering go, and once more a lumbering go. We'll roam the wild woods over, and once more a lumbering go.
Paul Bunyan was so tall, he covered miles with every step. Why, one day he started walking across the country. He walked across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and then stepped into the state of Wisconsin. There, he met an old farmer, his head bowed down with grief. The farmer told Paul his story.
I'm going down the road feeling bad. Oh, my crops have failed and now I'm feeling sad. My family is hungry and we have no place to live. I'm going down the road feeling bad.
And with 5 blows of his axe, Paul Bunyan cleared a space of 10 miles for a brand new farm. "Thank you, Paul Bunyan," cried the farmer. "You're welcome," said Paul, as he took an extra big step and walked from Wisconsin into Montana. Yes, Paul Bunyan did some remarkable things, all right. As a soldier in the Revolutionary War, he faced a whole line of cannon. As the Hessian soldiers fired at him, he picked up a tree trunk and batted their cannonballs right back, like baseballs. Once, when pirates were roaming the east coast of the United States, he splashed his foot in the ocean and started a wave that sank the whole pirate navy. Oh, and I almost forgot. He also built the Rocky Mountains.
Paul grabbed a hill with either hand with a ring-ting-a-tim-ring-a-tid-not-nay and set them down so they would stand in a row. He built the Rockies up so high the topmost peak held up the sky with a ring-ting-a-tim-ring-a-tid-not-nay.
Then came the biggest job of his life. The country had no inland waterway large enough for big ships carrying heavy freight. So Paul Bunyan began to dig. Soon he had scooped out hundreds of miles of earth. Now he wanted rain, so he clapped his hands together. And down poured the rain until the holes in the earth were filled. with the Great Lakes.
La 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 la.
Now, one of the Great Lakes was named Lake Erie, and the town of Buffalo was on its shore. It took just another day's work for Paul Bunyan to dig the Erie Canal from Buffalo to Albany, and the inland waterway was completed. In his later years, with his big jobs done, Paul Bunyan went back to one of his favorite hobbies, mountain making. But this was a mountain for children, a rock candy mountain.
Oh, the buzzing of the bees in the popcorn trees near the chocolate ice cream fountain, where the jelly beans grow and the milkshakes flow down the big rock candy mountain. Oh, the children eat their fill of the whipped cream hill, and no one's ever counting. There's so much to eat, life is one long treat on that big rock candy mountain.
Did Paul Bunyan really live? Well, nobody knows for sure.
Almighty Paul Bunyan, he lived long ago. His strength and his goodness helped America grow.
All right. So you're welcome. How many of you been to see this? This is up in NorCal near Trees of Mystery. How many of you been there? Yeah. There's actually many of these scattered throughout the United States. You know where the oldest one of these is located? The first one? Minnesota is where it was. Yeah. So pretty cool. The question at the end of that little cartoon, did Paul Bunyan actually live? And the narrator's kind of hemming and hawing, well, we'll never know, kind of a thing. It raises some interesting questions. Like, why would we tell these stories to our kids? Why keep the folklore, and why did they begin in the first place? You know, they kind of came together in the early 1900s. That's when they were sort of codified and used in marketing, actually, is how it all worked. But the stories were in circulation for some time. Can you imagine why they would make up stories about a guy named Paul Bunyan, who's 25 feet tall and actually only weighs 800 pounds? The guy's a rail, if that's true, right? Any thoughts on that?
Some are just old stories.
Just for fun stories. Yeah, you're around the campfire. Why not? Let's just sing a song and tell a goofy story about a guy who somehow made the Rocky Mountains. Okay, yeah, right. What else? Anything? Any ideas? Oh, I thought Mark was going to make an announcement there for a second. I was like, wow, this guy feels really strongly about his answer. Nope, just coffee. That's fine. Well, you know, one of the reasons why the folklore of Paul Bunyan exists is because it communicated something to the people. Yes, it was entertaining and kind of fun stories, and kids' imaginations kind of run wild about, wow, what would that be like, and all that. But in addition to that, thinking about the westward expansion of the United States, you have in Paul Bunyan part of the epitome of what a good American looked like. You've got an industrious worker. You've got a guy who works all day so that, not just for himself, but for other people, providing lumber so that, you know, towns and stuff could be built. We also found out that because he deforested so much that he probably is responsible for global warming. So thanks, Paul, right? And other things, you know, he's a good American war hero. I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that before. So he was there even during the Revolutionary War. How about that? And saved us all from pirates. It's pretty sweet. Well, we tell these stories not just for entertainment value, but because they communicate values in between them. And we use these stories as metaphor for kids to think about and wonder, well, what made that guy? And how can we be like that guy? And what do we want to do to be like that person? And this one particular book we're going to go deep in for the next few weeks is like that. The characters in this particular story, the historicity part of it is about the least important thing you need to know about. We're talking about the book of Daniel. And modern scholars, I just want to read this to you, because this might be new information, and it might be troubling information, but it doesn't really need to be. So this is from a current scholar. Although some of the court details seem at first sight to be impressive, most scholars argue that the Daniel stories, as well as the stories of his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are fictional accounts that represent the folklore of the diaspora communities, the scattered communities of Judaism. Furthermore, these details are something that a healthy imagination could create, drawing from the gossip and speculation of the surrounding peoples under Persian occupation. There was similar speculation about the pomp and circumstance of the Persian court among the Greeks as well. What the scholar is saying, and a large number of contemporary scholars agree, as he noted, that when we look at the book of Daniel, even though the stories are compelling and loaded with detail, the way we understand the genre itself in antiquity suggests that it is possible that Daniel, as an actual flesh and blood person, and his compatriots didn't actually exist. Or if they did, then their stories have been largely embellished for a larger purpose. Now, that can be very troubling if we grew up in a tradition that said the Bible is just as it says, it's plain as day, it's black and white, you believe it or you don't, and that settles it. But you need to understand that that rendering of the Bible and approaching the Bible is actually a very new way of rendering the Scriptures. And that is not the way ancient Jews approached the Scriptures. And it's not the way that Jesus would have approached the Scriptures. We have lots of evidence for that. So if we choose rather than our own modern way of thinking about the Bible and adopt rather a Jewish understanding of the Bible and how to approach it, then when we look at Daniel, we need to ask them, why was this book so valuable to you other than some kind of benefit in the canon? Why did it last the test of time, and why is it still important? We're only going to look at the first 6 chapters because the last 6 chapters are all apocalyptic prophecy that are kind of out there and are not particularly helpful for most people as they study things. It says a lot about the struggles that they went through, but not as helpful. It kind of takes us into left field. But the first 6 stories are actually meant to encourage people. You need to know the context of Daniel here, and we'll eventually help you understand why this makes any difference for us after the God can't stuff. When Daniel shows up in his book, he has been taken into exile. When we think about Israel, you can picture that country, and that's generally what we think of it. But you need to understand that the actual formal country of Israel, a unified group under a king, one state, so to speak, so like the United States or the United Tribes of Israel, that country in that way lived shorter than the United States. The tribes existed loosely, gathering together and helping each other out, but they didn't formalize really until around the time of King David, just a little bit before, and that way of kingdom lasted just beyond King Solomon, who was David's son. And the kingdom divided after a while. And so you had a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And northern kingdom is where Jesus lived. That's called Israel. And the southern kingdom around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, that was called Judah. And we're going to see in the story of Daniel that one of the other empires around the globe came and conquered their people and their land. Now, one scholar did some historical research to find out, well, how many battles actually happened in ancient Israel? Like, that weren't ancient Israel's battle that they were trying to fight. 200 wars happened in what we call Israel, because it was a thoroughfare. If you're on the European side and you wanted Northern Africa or Mesopotamia, you had to go through Israel. It was just one of the major freeways. And so it was a hot spot, and still is today. So that is a war-torn environment, and it always has been. It doesn't mean it should be, I'm just saying that it always has been. And what would happen, starting with the Assyrians, they came in and took some people out. They conquered Israel, took some people out of Israel. Then that was followed by the Babylonian Empire, and that was followed by the Persian Empire, and that was followed by the Greek Empire, and that was followed by the Roman Empire. Empire, starting in the 500s BC. One after another succession, which means nobody who was alive at the time and was Jewish at Jesus' time, none of them ever knew what it was like. There was 1 second that sort of was like it, but none of them ever really knew what it was like to be their own people and be stable in that kind of way. They always lived their life occupied. And so when we look at the story of Daniel, we're going to find out how that played out. So we're just going to read through it. I'm going to stop you a few times to point some stuff out, and then I got a point for you to think about when we get there that actually is very relevant to today. So let's check it out. This is Daniel chapter 1. So during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, you know what that means? That means they surrounded the city, and usually what they would do is starve the city out until they surrendered. And then sometimes they would kill the people inside because they had no use for them. So that's the flavor of what besieged meant. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. Now, just to stop for a second, so we are seeing a theological perspective here, which is not what was espoused in the book God Can't. Because God can't would suggest that God does not play chess with leaders in that kind of a way. So then you're left with a choice. Well, do I agree with Daniel's perspective that God put Nebuchadnezzar in charge to do his bidding? That is very problematic on a lot of levels. So you just need to mess with that. Personally, I don't agree with that, and I think that's totally okay. And I think there's room to wonder about that, but respect the writer of Daniel as they see it that way. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land along with some stuff from the temple, which will be important in a few weeks. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. So put him from the temple in Jerusalem to his temple in Babylon. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. So what are we reading here? People were brought from Jerusalem as captives into the foreign land. Cream of the crop folk. In fact, you get a flavor of that right here. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, Azariah was called Abednego. Those are the names you're familiar with from the story of the fiery furnace, which we'll look at in coming weeks. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by his king. Now we need to stop here and just pay attention to what's happening, because if you're familiar with the story, which many of you are, because even in Christian churches that don't pay much attention to their Jewish background, these are children's stories that show up in children's books, and children are taught these stories. And so they know about this. And sometimes when we look at this, we're like, wow, congratulations, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for making the cut. You did it. You know, my daughter spent her sophomore year in college abroad in Europe last year. And there's part of us that is probably thinking, oh my gosh, this is like a study abroad program. They nailed it. They're getting put up, they've got food, they've got drink, they're protected by the king, they've got a solid job offer coming their way. I mean, this is just amazing. How wonderful. And they even got cool new names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Belteshazzar, let's not forget that. I mean, how cool is this? You need to lose that idea, because that's not what's going on here. These guys were taken from their home. They were taken from their country. They were brought to this new country to be indoctrinated in the way of Babylon. This is not summer camp. This is not a summer abroad. This is 3 years of concentration camp where they have to learn this new language because they don't want to hear the Aramaic and the Jewish traditions that have been peddled in their whole life. There's no room now for their Jewish tradition in Babylon. They are wanting to wipe them clean of who they were, including their culture. So much that they stopped identifying them by their Hebrew names. What do you think of that? You're taken away, and now you don't even own your name. Nobody calls you by your name anymore. Unfortunately, we know a little bit about that in our country's history, because that's what we did with American slavery. Yes, there were people that, Africans who sold Africans in Africa. That's awful. There were Dutch people from my heritage that were the ones who helped get that whole process off the ground and bartering and selling human beings and brought them to our country where there were other human beings who were willing to buy those human beings as property. And when they came, guess what happened? They no longer were encouraged to use their own language. You're going to learn our language because you're mine. You are not going to worship the way you used to. We are going to teach you Christianity because that's the religion of this country. And we're going to take away your name. We wipe them clean. This happened with Native Americans too. We understand this in our history of what this actually looks like. Don't look at Daniel's experience as a study abroad program. Don't see this as grooming him for some sweet job someday. No. You think about American slavery. That's what it looks like. And we're going to find out that there's a fierceness to what is taking place that is incredibly hostile. And that gets into the next frame of the story. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. So, we know that there were lots of food restrictions in the Jewish tradition. So maybe they just kept rolling out the pulled pork sandwiches, and Daniel just kept saying, "Oh, we're not going to do that because I'm Jewish." So he asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now, God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded." So let's talk about the environment of Babylon. This is not a peaceful place. This is a place of very strict power and dictatorship. You don't follow what you're supposed to do, your life is on the line. It's that big of a deal. And for this guy, it's not Daniel's life, it's his own life for allowing it to even happen. But Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. "Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water," Daniel said. "At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see." The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel a special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Now, before we go to the next slide, I just want you to be aware of what is being said. The absolute underdogs here, who have been defeated by a superpower, are now shining examples in the face of greater power. And where there should be greater knowledge, greater strength, greater understanding, what we're seeing in the story is, oh, but the Jewish way, the Jewish people, they're the ones who in honoring God have in some way usurped the power of Babylon, even if in a small way. And now we finish this part of the chapter. Daniel remained in the loyal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. Now we'll get into this graphic here, which I know you can't read the small print, but the gist of it is you have our life kind of, quartered into body, heart, spirit, and mind. And my question for you today is, how are you in exile, and how are you honoring who you really are as a follower of Jesus? Because here's my contention. You and I are not in exile in any kind of a political way. And I don't think there's any real danger of that. As far as I know, the Canadians are just content staying north, and Mexico is content staying to the south. And so there's probably not a real imminent threat of you being ripped out of your home, transported to a foreign country where your name has changed, you're no longer allowed to do your life the way you really wanted to do in the American way. That's not going to happen. We live in this country. Most of us have grown up in this country, and so we have sensibilities that we've naturally allowed into our very being and our pores. Here's the thing. When we say yes to Jesus, when in our pursuit of God we say to ourselves, I think we recognize that Jesus nailed this thing. And we want to understand God through the lens of Jesus. And that means that we choose to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. That's our way. We're a Christian church, and it's not to the exclusion of some of these other ways. That's all fine and good. But where we're at is we're like, okay, well, I want to understand God as best as I can. And I look at Jesus, see an awful lot of God happening there, and I want to understand God through the way of Jesus. So that means I say yes to following Jesus. That's what it's about. And he becomes the one that we look at for our example, the way we think, the way we look at God, the way we interact with other people, our attitude, the whole 9 yards. That's the way we approach it. And what I'm suggesting to you is that when you say that word, when you make that commitment, when you make that decision, you are, in a sense, placing yourself in voluntary exile. Because the way of Jesus eventually is incongruent with many of the precepts and concepts and ethos of the United States. There are a whole bunch of isms that if you're not paying attention at all, and Jesus is just your genie in the bottle and is your ticket to heaven, and you're just kind of living until the holy bus takes you home, you're not even going to pay any attention to this. But if you actually are paying attention to what it means to call Jesus Lord, to call him Master, to say, I'm actually going to follow you, you are going to run into a handful of isms that you're going to know right away you're in exile. We live in a capitalistic country. Capitalism has done a lot of good for the world, but there are major limitations to capitalism. And where those limitations are, Jesus speaks into issues of greed in particular. Greed and self-promotion, even to the neglect and harm of others. That's an ism that is incongruent at that point with following Jesus. Consumerism, just buying the next new shiny thing because it's the next new shiny thing, or getting the next triple bypass heart burger from Carl's Jr. because it just looks so good on TV and you just have to do it. Or any number of things, the next new phone, the next new car, whatever that thing might be, the next new label, whatever it might be. Consumerism rules in our country. When 9/11 happened, do you remember what the advice was from the White House? Please go spend money, because we are a consumer-driven country. And consumerism has its limits in following Jesus. Racism is incongruent with Jesus. I found this graphic recently. A friend of mine posted it actually from another church. And I'll probably push it out because it just talks about how there were definite cases of racism that are clearly illustrated in the Bible, but they didn't stick. And one of the last ones to fold was racism against the Samaritan people. And that got loose because of Jesus. Jesus has no room for racism. So if we're in that kind of a vein, that's another ism that is not congruent with the way of Jesus. Sexism, that's another one. And I'm wondering what other isms you might be thinking of. Classism would be another one. What I'm saying is when you say yes to Jesus, you inadvertently take a step toward exile, even if you never leave your neighborhood, because it is a countercultural move. And if we actually hope that God will do something in the world, and if we really believe that God needs our help to do that, then that means that the ills that we see in the world, some of which are tied to those isms, means somebody needs to do something about it. Jesus followers. And what we understand is that we are up against a mountain of power. That if you really have an issue with some of these isms that are out there and you've recognized where they rub wrong against the tone and ethos of Jesus, that means that action needs to be taken. That means you're taking on Babylon. It means you're taking on empire. You're taking on the very power structures of our day, and that's a problem. The people of Israel around the time of Jesus' life. The book of Daniel, even though it speaks to an earlier time in history, was finally compiled just a century and a half or so before Jesus was born. And that's not uncommon. This is the way they organize them. The stuff was being talked about for probably centuries, but finally brought together at that time, and it was soothing to their ears, because they knew they were under the thumb of the Roman Empire, and their lives could be taken at any moment. But when they read the book of Daniel, they recognized there was a way to subvert the power that was right over them and enjoy a victory or two that would start to change things over time. This one is as simple as a dietary move. And for the people who read this story, people who were in exile, people who were under the authority, the regime, who could take their head off literally, when they see the underdog get a win, that was just music to their ears. The Jewish people knew they were outgunned. They knew that they didn't have the kind of power to overthrow the Roman government. That was obvious. There's no possible way in their time, barring some kind of crazy miracle of God, it's just not going to happen, but they can do some things here and there. We have stories like this in American folklore, revolving around the character Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox. These were stories shared one slave to another about how the feeble little rabbit somehow outwitted the fox, who thought as a predator he had it all figured out. And every little win, every little trick, every little way of working things out for the benefit of the rabbit was like a thumbing the nose at the slave owners and the system that created it. And it, over time, helped bring about change. You want to see change in the world? It means you embrace your exile-ness. It means you wake up to the fact that there are isms that we have very naturally adopted into our lives and in our worldview that are incongruent with the way of Jesus. And like I said before, if we just take a look at statistical reality, most people who claim to be Christian in America have not really paid attention to that, because the same problems that people who don't say yes to Jesus seem to be at the same rate as people who do say yes to Jesus. Which tells me that maybe there's a disconnect here between the people who claim to follow Jesus, that maybe they're not actually following Jesus, but they just have a Christian stamp on a very American ethos. We've wrapped the flag around the cross and didn't know the difference. But the true followers of Jesus, they knew it was on the line. They knew that life was at stake. And I want to inform you, your life is at stake. Your true self life is at stake. And not just you, but the people that you can potentially influence, their lives, the people who are at risk around you that we can do something about, their lives are at stake. Because the Jesus way is other-centered. It's bigger than our own little personal kingdoms, so that we can die with lots of stuff, so that our kids and grandkids can sell all of our stuff at a garage sale, right? There's a bigger vision for us than that. And it's to actually bring change into the world with the very Spirit of God behind us. That is how God can't ends, and where Daniel takes off to ask you, how are you going to say yes to Jesus you person in exile. So I have a challenge for you. Because I have a hunch that you could probably make a list of 10 things. 10 very simple things that just come to mind of things that you know are patterns in your life that you know aren't the best for you. They're not the healthiest thing. They're things you probably think about every December 31st. And you make a resolution, all right, this is the year. I'm going to get my 5,000 steps in or 10,000 steps or however many steps you're going after. Or I'm going to eat healthier this year because our whole country makes us think about that stuff. But maybe it has to do with how you're spending your money. Maybe it has to do with how you're spending your time. Maybe it has to do with what you're streaming on your TV. Maybe it has to do with the health of your key relationships. I bet there are 10 things you could put on a list where you could say, I know these things are not healthy. And so my challenge to you, especially if the answer to those things, if the healthy thing is congruent with the way of Jesus, which it almost always is, because the way of Jesus leads to our flourishing, not to our detriment, then I'm wondering if you could just, for the easy ones, just stop for 10 days. Stop for 10 days and see what happens. So if there's some crap you're watching on Netflix that really isn't helping you out at all, or if you're watching, here's an idea. Don't check your email before you go to bed. That's an easy one. Just don't do it. Don't watch the news right before you go to bed unless you really like nightmares. It's not gonna work out. There are a whole range of things. Take the walk instead of sitting around like a potato, like I am prone to do on occasion. I don't know what those things are, but I'm just asking you for 10 days, give it a shot. For the easy ones that you know, this is the healthy way. Just do it and see what happens. Ask yourself the question along the way. Why is it that I got into this pattern? Because you got into a pattern of unhealth. And sometimes the only way we recognize what is allowing the unhealth to happen is when we step out of unhealth into health, and whatever that means. So I'm asking for 10 days just to choose a little healthier and see what happens. I know one thing that will happen. It'll be a challenge, and you will find out what systems you find yourself in that are keeping you right where you are. Systems of our culture, systems of ways of thinking in our space. And I think you're also going to find out that there's hope, that if you want to see change in yourself, if you want to join God in what God is trying to do to bring health and healing into the world, it's possible because the Spirit of God is with us. And the victory may not be massive, and it may not even be noticed by most people. Like Daniel's food thing wasn't noticed by people, but you'll notice. And the people around you will notice, and it is a small victory on a way to a bigger kind of victory that usurps the system. It is subversive. And in that subversiveness, it's pretty exciting. We are called to change the world with the Spirit of God in our sails. How will you start to choose that, recognizing that you can? Let's pray together. So God, as we move from this space into life, away from this break, away from this sanctuary moment, I pray that you will bring to our minds the things that very easily come to our minds that we know aren't the healthiest choices, aren't the healthiest ways. They could be behaviors or attitudes. I don't know. And I pray that we'll just make that list and just go with the easiest ones first and just see what happens if we just stop. That we might wake up to the pressures on our lives, the systems that we found ourselves in. And we might start living a more healthy life that will not just benefit us, but begin to benefit others because we're healthy and we can spread health a little bit more. God, we ask this not just for our own sake, but because you call us to something greater than ourselves. And we're encouraged by Daniel that you're in the process. You're with us in the trenches. You see what we're up against, and you are with us. So we accept your help and your strength as we move forward together to change the world. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for coming today. It's going to be a fun little ride through the first 6 chapters of Daniel. And if you got any feedback for us or offering that helps so much, we deeply appreciate both. Please leave those in the buckets on the table. And if you can help tear down the chairs and tables, that will be really, really helpful. Thanks a lot. See you next week.